Officer Daniel Parker had seen his fair share of strange encounters on the job, but nothing quite like this. It started as a routine patrol through a quiet neighborhood, the early morning air crisp and still. That's when he noticed it. A small German shepherd puppy trailing him, its tiny paws barely making a sound against the pavement. At first, he ignored it, assuming it was just another stray. But something felt off. The way it stayed close, eyes locked onto him, as if it needed something. Daniel slowed his pace, expecting the pup to get distracted and wander away. But it didn't. When he stopped, it stopped. When he turned, it turned. Then, as he kneeled down to take a closer look, he saw it dark, damp patches on its fur. His stomach clenched. Blood. Not fresh, but enough to send a wave of concern through him. Whose blood was it? The puppy didn't look injured, but its trembling body and desperate gaze told him everything. This wasn't just a lost dog. It was leading him somewhere. A strange, unsettling feeling crept into Daniel's gut. Was this some kind of trap? He glanced around the deserted street, his instincts on high alert. But when the puppy took a few hesitant steps forward, then stopped and looked back at him, pleading, he knew he couldn't ignore it. Something had happened, and this tiny creature was the only witness. Taking a deep breath, Daniel stood up and followed. He had no idea what he was about to walk into, but something told him this would be a case he'd never forget. A cold breeze whispered through the empty streets as Officer Daniel followed the small, determined puppy. The early morning stillness had an eerie weight to it, the kind that made every distant sound feel amplified: rustling leaves, the occasional creak of an unseen door, the soft echo of his own footsteps. The streetlights flickered, casting long, distorted shadows that stretched across the cracked pavement. It felt as though the entire world was holding its breath. Daniel's heartbeat drummed steadily in his chest as he tightened his grip on his flashlight. His instincts screamed caution, but the urgency in the puppy's movements pushed him forward. Where was it leading him? Each turn took them deeper into a part of town he rarely patrolled. A section with abandoned houses, broken fences, and a history of forgotten stories. Something about this place felt wrong, like an unspoken warning lingering in the air. His pulse quickened when the puppy suddenly stopped at the entrance of a dilapidated house. The windows were shattered, the wooden door hanging slightly ajar, swaying ever so slightly as though beckoning him inside. A heavy silence loomed over the scene, thick and suffocating. Daniel hesitated. His training told him to call for backup, but something about the way the puppy whimpered, its tiny body trembling with urgency, made him push forward. The darkness beyond the doorway swallowed the light from his flashlight, as if reluctant to reveal its secrets. Whatever had happened here, whatever had drawn this helpless animal to seek him out, it was waiting for him inside. Officer Daniel Carter had been on the force for nearly a decade. He had seen the best and worst of humanity, the small acts of kindness that restored his faith and the horrors that kept him awake at night. But nothing had prepared him for this moment. As he stood before the dilapidated house, watching the trembling German shepherd puppy whimper at his feet, a familiar weight settled in his chest. It wasn't just the unease of an unknown situation. It was something deeper, something personal. Daniel wasn't just a cop. He was a man haunted by the past. A year ago, he had lost his K-9 partner, Rex, in the line of duty. The bond between an officer and his dog was unlike anything else. Unbreakable, loyal, forged through trust and hardship. The loss had left a scar, one he had tried to bury beneath long shifts and forced smiles. But now, staring at this helpless puppy looking up at him with pleading eyes, that scar threatened to reopen. Taking a deep breath, Daniel knelt beside the puppy, running a gentle hand over its matted fur. "Where are you taking me, buddy?" he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. The puppy let out a soft whine before nudging its head toward the open door. Daniel exhaled sharply. Something about this moment felt significant, like a test or a reckoning. As he pushed the door open, the old wood groaned under his touch. The air inside was thick with dust and the unmistakable scent of damp rot. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating scattered papers, broken furniture, And something else. A child's shoe, small and out of place. His stomach clenched. Daniel's mind raced. Was someone inside? Was this why the puppy had come to him? His fingers instinctively hovered over the radio on his shoulder, but he hesitated. If a child was in trouble, every second counted. The puppy trotted ahead, pausing every few steps to look back, urging him forward. Despite the years of training and experience, Daniel felt an unease that was different from the usual dangers of his job. It was the uncertainty, the feeling that whatever he was about to discover would change him in ways he wasn't prepared for. But he had no choice. He had to move forward. With a deep breath, Daniel stepped inside, unaware that the past he had tried to escape was waiting for him in the shadows. As Officer Daniel Carter stepped inside the decaying house, the wooden floor groaned under his weight. The air was thick with dust, and an eerie silence filled the space, broken only by the occasional drip of water from a leaking pipe somewhere in the distance. The German Shepherd puppy moved ahead cautiously, its small paws barely making a sound against the creaking boards. Every few steps, it paused, looking back at him as if urging him to follow. Daniel's instincts were on high alert. His hand hovered near his holster as he swept the flashlight across the room. The furniture was old and broken, the wallpaper peeling in long, jagged strips. Signs of abandonment were everywhere, but something felt off, like the house had been left in a hurry. His beam of light stopped on a shattered picture frame lying face down on the floor. He knelt, flipping it over. The glass had cracked, but he could make out a faded photograph of a young woman holding the very same puppy that had led him here. A little boy stood beside her, grinning widely. A chill ran down Daniel's spine. Where were they now? A sudden noise snapped him out of his thoughts. A faint, muffled sound, almost like a whimper, coming from deeper inside the house. His grip tightened on his flashlight. The puppy barked softly, then ran toward a door at the end of the hallway, scratching at it frantically. Daniel approached carefully, his pulse quickening. He reached out, testing the knob. It was locked. He took a step back, bracing himself before kicking the door open. The old wood splintered on impact, swinging inward with a loud crack. His flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing a small, cluttered room. His breath caught in his throat. Huddled in the corner, clutching a tattered blanket, was a little boy. His face was streaked with dirt, his eyes wide with fear. The moment the beam of light landed on him, he flinched, pressing himself further into the corner as if trying to disappear. "Hey, buddy," Daniel said softly, lowering himself to the boy's level. "It's okay. You're safe now." The boy didn't respond. His hands clutched the blanket tighter, his tiny shoulders trembling. The puppy trotted over, licking the boy's arm, and for the first time, Daniel saw a flicker of relief in his eyes. "Where's your mom?" Daniel asked gently. The boy's lip quivered. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a choked sob escaped. Daniel's stomach twisted. Something terrible had happened here. He reached for his radio to call for backup, but just as he pressed the button, the boy suddenly grabbed his wrist. "Shoo!" the child whispered, his eyes darting to the doorway in pure terror. Daniel froze. The boy wasn't just scared, he was terrified of something still here. The hairs on the back of Daniel's neck stood up. He turned slowly, scanning the dim hallway. For a moment, all he could hear was the sound of his own breathing. Then, a creak. Not from the old house settling. Something else. Daniel's training kicked in. He reached for his gun, his senses on high alert. He whispered to the boy, "Stay here. Don't move." The child clung to the puppy, his small body shaking. Daniel rose slowly, stepping back into the hallway, his flashlight sweeping across the shadows. He strained to hear past the pounding of his own heartbeat. Then he saw it, a figure lurking near the entrance. A man. He was standing just inside the doorway, barely visible in the dim light. His clothes were ragged, his posture rigid. His face was hidden in the shadows, but Daniel could feel the weight of his stare. "Police!" Daniel commanded, aiming his gun. "Show me your hands." The figure didn't move. Daniel tightened his grip, stepping forward cautiously. I said, show me your... The man lunged. Daniel barely had time to react before the intruder swung at him, knocking the flashlight from his grip. Darkness swallowed them as they crashed into the wall. The man was strong, stronger than he looked. He fought with desperation, his movements wild and unpredictable. Daniel struggled to regain control, twisting out of the man's grip. He managed to land a solid punch to the attacker's ribs, sending him stumbling back. For a split second, the man's face caught the moonlight streaming through a broken window. Daniel's breath hitched. He recognized him, the man from the photograph, the boy's father. But something was wrong. His eyes were hollow, his face gaunt. He looked like he hadn't eaten in days. Please, the man gasped, holding up his hands. I didn't mean to. Daniel kept his gun trained on him, his breath coming fast. You've got 5 seconds to explain before I call this in. Tears welled up in the man's eyes. He pointed toward the room where his son was hiding. I was trying to protect him, he whispered. Daniel hesitated. His gut told him there was more to this than a simple break-in. The man's desperation, the boy's terror, it all pointed to something much darker. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but something still didn't add up. And Daniel had a terrible feeling that the worst was yet to come. Daniel stood frozen, his pulse hammering in his ears. The man in front of him, gaunt, disheveled, his hollow eyes filled with fear, wasn't acting like an intruder. His trembling hands were raised, his breath uneven, and yet, something about his presence sent a chill down Daniel's spine. The puppy whimpered softly, pressing itself against the little boy, who clung to it as if it was the only thing keeping him safe. You don't understand, the man whispered, barely audible over the creaking of the old house. They're coming. Daniel tightened his grip on his gun, every nerve in his body on high alert. Who's coming? He demanded. The man swallowed hard, his gaze darting to the shadows beyond the broken window. The night outside seemed unnaturally still, the air heavy with an eerie silence. They don't like the light, he murmured, barely above a whisper. That's why they let you in. A shiver ran down Daniel's spine. The logical part of his brain fought against the rising dread creeping into his chest. The man was clearly exhausted, possibly delusional. He had likely been squatting here for days, his mind unraveling in the isolation. And yet, something about the raw terror in his voice made Daniel hesitate. Then the lights flickered. The dim glow from his flashlight, now lying on the floor, pulsed weakly before sputtering out completely. The darkness swallowed the room in an instant. The little boy let out a sharp gasp, and the puppy growled, its tiny body stiff with fear. Daniel reached for his backup flashlight, but the moment his fingers grazed the cold metal, a deep, guttural sound echoed from the hallway, a sound that did not belong to any human. The air in the room shifted, growing thick and suffocating. Daniel felt it before he saw it. A slow, crawling presence pressing in from the shadows. His heartbeat pounded in his chest as his eyes adjusted to the darkness. And then he saw them, figures, moving, watching, waiting. They stood just beyond the reach of the moonlight, their forms barely distinguishable against the gloom. Tall, distorted, their limbs stretched in unnatural ways. Their faces, if they even had faces, were obscured, hidden beneath a shifting, writhing blackness that seemed to flicker in and out of existence. The man let out a strangled sob. I told you, he choked out. They were waiting for the dark. Daniel's mind raced. He didn't believe in ghosts, in monsters, in things that lurked in the night. But what he saw before him wasn't a trick of the light. It wasn't exhaustion playing games with his vision. It was real. The figures stepped forward, their movements eerily slow, deliberate. Daniel raised his gun, but deep down, a horrifying realization settled in. Bullets wouldn't stop this. The boy let out a small whimper, burying his face into the puppy's fur. The man's breath came in rapid, panicked gasps. We have to leave, he pleaded. Now. Daniel didn't hesitate. He grabbed the boy, lifting him into his arms as the puppy barked wildly. The man stumbled to his feet, but the moment he turned toward the door, something lashed out from the darkness. A shadowy hand, elongated and impossibly thin, snapped toward him, wrapping around his ankle. The man screamed, his fingers clawing at the floor as he was yanked backward. Daniel lunged, grabbing his wrist. "Hold on," he shouted. The man's eyes locked onto his, sheer terror pooling in them. "Don't let them take me," he begged. Daniel tightened his grip, pulling with everything he had. The figures in the darkness hissed, the sound sharp and unnatural. More hands, if they could even be called that, emerged from the black void, reaching, twisting, writhing toward their prey. Daniel gritted his teeth, adrenaline coursing through his veins. He wasn't going to let go. He couldn't let go. Then, in the chaos, the little boy's voice rang out, piercing through the suffocating fear. "Daddy!" Daniel's grip faltered. The shock of the word hit him like a freight train. The man struggling in his grasp wasn't just some deranged squatter. He was the boy's father. A second of hesitation, a single moment of distraction, and the shadows dragged him away. His scream was swallowed by the darkness, leaving nothing but silence behind. Daniel's breath came in ragged gasps as the man's final scream echoed through the darkness. Then silence. The oppressive weight of the shadows seemed to thicken, pressing against Daniel's skin like an invisible force. He stood frozen, his pulse hammering in his ears, his grip tightening protectively around the little boy still clinging to him. The puppy whimpered, ears pinned back, its small body trembling. His mind screamed at him to move, to run, but his body refused to obey. His eyes remained fixed on the void where the man had been just seconds ago. There was no trace of him now. No body, no blood, not even a whisper of his existence. It was as if he had been swallowed whole by the darkness itself. The figures loomed closer, shifting in unnatural ways, their movements slow but deliberate. They didn't rush toward him. They didn't need to. They knew he was trapped. Daniel clenched his jaw, forcing himself to think. He had spent years facing danger, dealing with criminals, surviving violent encounters, but nothing had prepared him for this. He was a man of logic, of reason. Monsters weren't real, and yet here they were. Then, the boy whimpered softly against his chest. Daniel looked down at him, seeing the silent terror in his wide, tear-filled eyes. He had just lost his father, his world, right in front of him. And now, if Daniel didn't act, he would lose everything else, too. No, not on his watch. With renewed determination, he tightened his hold on the boy and reached down for the flashlight that had fallen during the chaos. His fingers fumbled over the cold metal, and for one agonizing second, he feared it was broken. But then a flicker, a spark, and light. The beam cut through the darkness like a blade, illuminating the figures that had been closing in. The moment the light touched them, they shrieked, a piercing, unearthly sound that sent shivers down Daniel's spine. The shadows recoiled violently, writhing like smoke caught in the wind. Daniel didn't hesitate. He spun around and bolted for the door, his feet pounding against the wooden floor as he sprinted through the hallway. The puppy ran alongside him, its tiny legs moving as fast as they could. The boy's grip tightened around his neck, his small fingers digging into Daniel's shirt. Behind them, the darkness surged forward, desperate, hungry. The figures shrieked again, the sound a twisted blend of rage and agony. Daniel reached the front door and slammed into it with his shoulder, sending it bursting open. He didn't stop. He charged outside, running until he was well beyond the porch, beyond the dead grass, beyond the reach of the shadows. Then suddenly the noise stopped. The air around him shifted. The oppressive weight that had clung to him vanished. He turned, heart still hammering, and saw the darkness retreating, pulling back into the house as if recoiling from an unseen force. The figures stood at the threshold, just beyond the doorframe. They did not follow. They couldn't. Daniel's breath hitched. The man's words echoed in his mind. They don't like the light. The house, that cursed house, was their prison. They could only hunt within its walls, waiting for victims to stumble inside. The man had known. That's why he had stayed. That's why he had pleaded for Daniel to leave before nightfall. And now it was too late for him. Daniel's stomach twisted with guilt, but there was no time to mourn. The boy sobbed quietly against his chest, his small frame shaking. Daniel knelt down, placing a gentle hand on his back. "Hey," he murmured, his voice softer now, reassuring. "You're safe. I've got you." The puppy licked the boy's cheek, whimpering softly, and for the first time, the child looked up. His lips trembled, and through his tears, he whispered a single, heartbreaking word. "Daddy." Daniel swallowed the lump in his throat. He couldn't give the boy the answer he wanted. He couldn't bring his father back, but he could protect him. He glanced back at the house one last time, the shadows shifting behind the broken windows, watching, waiting. Then, without another word, he turned away and carried the boy into the night, toward safety, toward light, toward whatever came next. But deep in his chest, he knew one thing for certain. That house would always be waiting for its next visitor. And next time, someone else might not be as lucky. As Daniel drove away from that cursed house, his grip tightened on the steering wheel. The little boy sat in the passenger seat, wrapped in a blanket, his small fingers clutching the German Shepherd puppy like a lifeline. The child hadn't spoken since they left, except for that one word, "Daddy." It echoed in Daniel's mind, heavier than anything he had ever faced in his years as a police officer. What had happened back there wasn't something he could explain in a report. No amount of logic could justify the darkness that swallowed a man whole, the way the shadows seemed alive, or how the very walls of that house pulsed with something unholy. He knew no one would believe him, and maybe that was for the best. But as much as Daniel wanted to forget, he couldn't. He had seen true horror. Not the kind from crime scenes or tragic accidents, but something older, hungrier. That house had taken a father from his son. And yet, somehow, fate had spared Daniel and the boy. Why? Daniel glanced at the rearview mirror, his reflection staring back at him. He wasn't the same man who had stepped into that house. He had witnessed something that shouldn't exist, and he had barely made it out alive. He had felt true helplessness, true terror, and yet he had also found something else. Purpose. The boy had no one now. No home. No family. But Daniel had made a silent promise the moment he carried him out of that house. He wasn't going to let the darkness win. Taking a deep breath, Daniel reached over, gently placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. The child looked up at him, his eyes filled with sorrow but also something fragile, hope. "You're safe now," Daniel said softly. "I promise." And as they disappeared into the night, the house stood silently behind them, waiting, watching, because it was never over. If you made it this far, you must have felt the chills. But the question remains, was it really over? Could the darkness still be lurking, waiting for another victim? Or did Daniel truly break free from whatever haunted that house? What do you think? Share your thoughts and theories in the comments below. If you love eerie, suspenseful stories like this, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss a tale that keeps you up at night. Your support helps us bring you more spine-chilling content. And don't forget, turn on the notification bell so you're the first to experience our next terrifying story. Who knows what horrors await? Stay safe, stay curious, and we'll see you in the next one. If you dare.